are always there, but are especially acute in a drought year like this one, or in long-term drought periods like we've experienced. Okay, so we can step back also and think about what drought even is, which is surprisingly complicated. So if you see a media story, it might show some cracked soil that looks like that. That's certainly one impact that drought can have. That can mean problems for agriculture. This is a dryland cornfield out in Phillips County a few years ago, and they had a real bad drought, and it was not looking very good. And a lot of crops in Colorado are in similar state this year with the drought conditions. It might mean shrinking reservoir supplies. This is Lake Powell. The last time it was extremely low, it's now extremely low again. And we're seeing that at reservoirs throughout the West. You might think of drought being something like the Dust Bowl with big dust storms. That is certainly a drought impact that can take place. And maybe wildfire is now front of mind as well. Drought years tend to be bad wildfire years. So all of these are potential impacts of drought, and this we use this quote a lot from Kelly Redmond, who was a kind of a pioneer in Western climate science. That as with rainbows, each person experiences their own drought. If you're a farmer, or if you're a water manager, or if you're a city government official, or just a regular person, you might see the effects of drought a little bit differently, and that is to be expected. And we can think about different kinds of drought. Meteorological drought, basically just when it doesn't rain for an extended period of time, which then leads to hydrologic drought if it lasts long enough that the water supplies become affected in a negative way. Agricultural drought, when crops are affected. Socioeconomic drought, when the impacts of all of that start to be felt by people and economies and so forth, and also ecological drought, when ecosystems are affected. So these are all different ways that drought can play out at different timescales, and some of the different impacts it can have. Okay, so that's some introduction to lead us into where things stand now. And yeah, I guess one other piece of background. We'll look at the maps from the U.S. Drought Monitor in a minute, but just the really short background of how those are developed is, imagine you've got 100 years of data from wherever you are, and you would line them out from dry on the left to wet on the right. Most of the years maybe are somewhere in the middle. The wet ones are on the right. We won't talk much about that today, but then maybe your 30 driest years are in the abnormally dry category, and your 10 driest years are what we might call severe drought, and like your 2 driest years are in the exceptional drought, or what shows up as D4 on the U.S. Drought Monitor map. And so this also varies from place to place, right? It's all relative to what the normal conditions are in that place. A drought in Florida certainly looks different from a drought in Colorado, but they're both drought for that area. Okay, so now let's take a look at how we've gotten to where we are now. There's a lot of stuff on this graph, but that's why I like it, because we can kind of see the whole water year up to this point on a single figure, and I'll leave it up for a while and walk through what's all here. So the top panels are temperature. And so we often look at things from the water year basis, October through September, same as the federal fiscal year. It captures the buildup of snow in the mountains in the fall and winter, and then the melt out through the spring and summer. So this goes back to October last fall through a few days ago. Temperature on the top, the black line is the average temperature for each day of the water year, and then the red or the blue bars are whether it was warmer or colder than average on that particular day. And then beneath that are the aggregate of the months up to this point. And so if we look at temperature on the top, really what we're seeing for this water year is warm and warm and warm and warm. We had the warmest December on record, the warmest February, the warmest March statewide, just wrapped up the second warmest July. And so we can see this too, just the extreme warmth back in December, just extremely warm conditions and into January. The one cold wave we had was towards the end of January. But then February was really warm. And then we had the record smashing heat wave in the second half of March. And then it's continued to be, May was more normal, but then it's continued to be warm during the summer. Generally, the variations in the summer are not as big, so these don't look as extreme, but it's also hotter in the summer. And so we've seen a hotter than average summer as well. And then on the bottom is for precipitation, and it's more like a bank account where if we have a surplus or a deficit over the water year, and you can see that starting in December, we've just been building up this deficit. We've had a few wetter periods mixed in, but it's just kind of the deficits of all those rainy periods have done is eat into the deficit a little bit, but we're nowhere back close to normal. So, some of the periods that stand out here were March and April, especially in eastern Colorado, were extremely dry and also very warm. June was really dry in a lot of places. On the Front Range, July was dry. August has been very dry up to this point. Hopefully that'll change in the next couple days. But we can see, how we've gotten here. A lot of warmth and not a lot of precipitation. One other way of looking at this is, and this is a sort of a complicated chart here too, that I will try to walk us through because it's got a lot of information of comparing this year to past years. So this is for the period from October through the end of July, statewide again, so averaged over the whole state. Basically, the horizontal axis here is precipitation, the vertical is temperature. So it shows the four different quadrants of where we can be. And the drought quadrant's the upper left, the warm and dry. If you're in the upper right, it's warm and wet. Lower left is cool and dry. Lower right is cool and wet. And these are for all the years going back to the late 1800s across Colorado. And 2026 so far, October through July, we see way up here, far warmer than any other October through July period that we have on record in Colorado. And you kind of you look at all the different years, and they're mostly clustered together towards the middle, and that's kind of how the plot is designed. But there's two that really jump out. One is this year, 2026. The other is 2002. So 2002 is by far the driest water year we've ever had. And 2026 thus far has been the warmest that we've ever had. And so those are our two really bad drought years. There's been a lot of other bad droughts in the past, but you can kind of see how those 2 years really just are set apart from all the others, at least for looking at it from the period from October through July. Okay. So now making that a little bit more granular, maybe looking at it around the state. This is what the current U.S. Drought Monitor map looks like. This is last week's map. New map will come out tomorrow morning. That'll from data through yesterday. But we can see almost the whole state in drought conditions, and like 91% of the state in drought, 97% in abnormally dry or worse. Close to half the state in D3, extreme drought or worse, and then 13 or so percent in D4, which is the worst category. The place where the drought has just been going on for so long and has been relentless has been up in the mountains and parts of the West Slope, where they've been in D4 for a long time right now because their snow was very bad. Well, last summer was hot and dry. The snowpack was bad, and then it's been a hot and dry summer up to this point as well. So just relentless drought there. But most of the Front Range now is also in D3 and part of the Denver Metro in D4 there. So it's we can see how bad it's been around the different regions of the state. And this is how it's changed over the last couple months. We can see that the mountains have just been bad and stayed bad. The Front Range here we had a wet May, and so conditions improved a little bit in May, but then June and July have been dry, and so things have gotten worse again. parts of the Northeast Plains have had more thunderstorm activity this summer, so things have improved at least a bit there. Okay, so now we can look back a little bit at the winter and how we got here, going back to last winter, and just this may be obvious. You probably folks are aware of this, but we pay a lot of attention to what's going on with the snowpack in the mountains each winter. And why is that? Well, number one reason is water. That's our water supply, not for just us here in Colorado, but for all those river systems that go downstream and for millions of people in all directions. So that's a big one. Probably number two is winter recreation. It's a big part of our economy. It's a big part of what Colorado's identity is: skiing and snowboarding and snowmobiling in the winter, and then having also water in the rivers for fishing and rafting and such in the summer. So both of those are really closely tied to the mountain snowpack and why we pay it. And there's other reasons too, but those are two big reasons. And as is hopefully clear, the mountain snowpack this last year was awful, the lowest on record that we have since snowpack has been measured. This graph shows, so the green line here is the long-term average. The red line was the previous lowest year, and then the black was this year. And so we can see it reached a bad peak about half of average, but it was early, and then we had that March heat wave that just depleted the snowpack. The meltout slowed down a little bit with cooler conditions late April into early May, but still melted out way early. So just a bad situation all around with the mountain snowpack. And then that's led us to have bad conditions in the rivers. So what this map shows is the percentile rank for whatever number of years that river has had measurements on it for the period from April through July, which is when most of the water flows in the rivers in Colorado. That's the reflection of when the snow is melting out, and that's when the big peak happens in the spring and summer. And so here on the map, if you see a 0, it was the lowest year on record for how many ever years of records they have. If it's a 1, it's the second worst on record, and so forth. And you see pretty much everywhere in Colorado, it's in the bottom few, if not the worst year on record in terms of stream flow and water supply. And there's nowhere that there are good numbers. I think the highest number on here is the 12th percentile down here in southern Colorado. So just kind of bleak conditions in terms of river flows, as was expected with the bad snowpack. Okay, we'll look out now a little farther into the future of what the farther future may hold in terms of climate change, and then come back to the closer future, because there is some good news in that part. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this here just for the sake of time, but if you're interested, our office led the update of the Climate Change in Colorado report. It was published a couple of years ago. All there's kind of an executive summary, but lots of maps and graphs and other analysis on the website here, which is climatechange.colostate.edu. But I'll highlight just a couple of things. One, the takeaway results in terms of the two key climate variables of temperature and precipitation. Temperature, it's been getting warmer in Colorado and globally. It's expected to continue getting warmer in Colorado and globally with very high confidence because of greenhouse gas emissions, and greenhouse gas concentrations continue to be high, and we know that warms up the planet. Precipitation is more complicated. Recent years and decades have been drier than the decades before, but we don't really know whether that is a trend or a kind of cycle that may turn back around. So future change is uncertain going forward. But as we often say, climate change is water change. So even if we don't know what's happening with precipitation, the rising temperatures have important influences on our water. So we've seen declines in the spring snowpack in our mountains. We've seen with even higher confidence, even more robust signal in terms of earlier runoff earlier melt out of that snow and runoff into our rivers. Generally trends towards lower stream flow, although there's also a lot of year-to-year variability in that, but big increases in evaporative demand because warmer air is thirstier, and then that depletes the soil moisture in the summer. So, these are the ways that, and a lot of this is driven by temperature rather than by changes in precipitation, which are a little harder to pin down. But I'll kind of show how that all ties together here. So again, if you have a garden or you have a lawn, you know that if it's warm, if it's windy, if it's not, if it's sunny, if it's less humid, then that air is thirstier for water. Everything needs more water in those conditions. The plants, the trees, the soils, the reservoirs, the rivers, you name it. And so that thirst for water goes up with warming. It's increase in evaporative demand from the atmosphere. And so we can see what that means for Colorado, for how we think about drought in Colorado, looking at this long-term time series. So this goes back to the late 1800s. This, again, is averaged up over the whole state and averaged over like 2-year periods. And it highlights the wet periods and the dry periods across the state in terms of precipitation. So if you see green, those were years and decades that were relatively wet. If you see brown, it was years and decades that were relatively dry. And so we see some of the droughts that you might think of historically. Like the turn of the 20th century was a really bad drought, especially in Western Colorado. You've got the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, the 1950s, and then some of the droughts we've had since the turn of the millennium. But also the wet periods, like the 80s and 90s, were quite wet in Colorado. So we see here the natural cycles of precipitation, wet periods, and dry periods coming and going. But when we add in the effects of temperature, that'll be the next graph, and the whole graph will change a little, but it'll especially change on the right because that's when the warming has really shown up. And so this is what it looks like when we include the influence of that evaporative demand, that increased thirst for water. So what we see is, here precipitation only, here precipitation plus temperature. We see that the dry years, the droughts where there's not a lot of precipitation, look worse. And then the wet periods don't look as wet, and the droughts look longer. And this is what climate change does to drought is, again, drought's a natural part of our weather and climate here, but it takes the bad years and makes them worse. It takes the good years and makes them not quite as good, and puts stress on water resources across the board. So this just kind of some takeaways on the climate change in Colorado findings. Again, happy to elaborate if there's specific questions, because I didn't spend much time on that. But we've seen more warming. Trends in precipitation are less clear, but we're already seeing influences on snowpack, soil moisture, stream flows, and the things that rely on that, like heat waves, drought, wildfires. And that's all expected to continue with further warming. So further warming is very high confidence expected in Colorado. Less certainty in future precipitation change, but again, the warming leads to water changes and leads to worsening conditions with respect to heat waves and droughts and wildfires and so forth. Okay, so there's the bad news there. The short term. But the kind of the other thing to keep in mind, right, is this assumes future emissions that are roughly in line with current policies, but that is not locked in, right? That's the biggest uncertainty of all, is we don't know what we as society will do in the coming decades, years and decades. Other trajectories are possible. Emissions could be much higher. They could be much lower, depending on the decisions and actions that are taken in the future. So those bad outcomes are not necessarily locked in, but that's what it looks like based on the track that we're on right now. Okay, so that's the bad news out for the future. The short-term good news is that the pattern's finally changing. We've already got some cooler air in this afternoon. The next few days are expected to have really good rain chances. across eastern Colorado in particular, really most of the state. So there's some places, not everywhere is going to get a lot of rain, but some places will certainly get rain. Especially Thursday, Friday, Saturday seem to be the most favorable days for rain. Hopefully, it's good steady rain and not flash floods. But there is some moisture in the forecast. And then looking a little bit out into the fall, we are now in El Nino conditions. It looks like it's going to be a very strong El Nino. The influences in Colorado of El Nino are strongest in the fall. And so it gives us some confidence that the fall will probably be wet. Will it be wet enough to really alleviate the drought? That's probably too early to say. And similarly, it's hard to say what the effects on the snowpack next winter will be. But I think we can at least have some cautious optimism that it's not going to be as bad as last year was, and that we might get at least some level of relief as we get into the fall and hopefully beyond. And we see that in the NOAA outlooks. The temperature outlook doesn't show a whole lot for the fall season, but we do see that across much of the Southwest, the odds are tilted towards a wetter than average fall season. So fingers crossed on that coming through and persisting for longer. But no guarantees with El Nino either, and we'll have to see what happens. Okay, and then just lastly, just to advertise for a couple things, how people can contribute to drought monitoring, weather and climate monitoring, all of that. Number one is you can join COCORAS. So this is the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network that was founded here at CSU by my predecessor and state climatologist, Nolan Duskin. People put these plastic rain gauges in their backyards and measure the rain each day, or measure a lot of zeros this year. And it's hugely useful information for us, for the National Drought Monitor authors, for the National Weather Service, and everything. So the website's cocoras.org if you want to sign up, or if you have folks that you work with that want to know what they can do to help. And especially if you're kind of a weather nerd and like to keep track of what's happening with the conditions. Another that we've been encouraging people to do, if you aren't signed up for COCORAS, like if there's drought impacts in your community, agriculture, water resources, whatever, people can submit these condition monitoring observer reports. Anyone can submit them. A lot of them come in from farmers and ranchers reporting their conditions, but it can also be whatever other conditions people are seeing, and those are also looked at by the Drought Monitor authors. So I will stop there. There's our website and my contact. We do monthly summaries. The July one just came out yesterday. You can subscribe to get those in your email. You can also subscribe to get our blog posts that come out occasionally with some deep dives on Colorado climate topics. So I will stop there. Hopefully I didn't run too long, and happy to take questions with what time there is.
Well, great. Thank you very much for that. We had planned to move right into our Grand County Drought Preparedness person at 6:30, but I think we'll maybe take a little bit of time for questions now while we have you, Russ. And then, what will end up happening is what always happens is it'll cut into our basic community updates at the end. But this is great food for thought. So questions for Russ here?
No. Well,
yeah.
I'll go.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what the cities and communities can do to try and mitigate climate as much as possible to prevent this from continuing to get worse.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, and some of it probably depends on the priorities and the resources available to each of those communities. From the perspective of water, conserving water is good, right? And that's probably the top of mind thing when it comes to drought years like this, is getting people and businesses and everything to conserve those water resources as much as possible. In terms of climate change going forward, then it's so the more that greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise, the the more warming there's going to be. So that's kind of how that is expected to play out. And so actions that reduce those emissions are things that will start to stem the tide of climate change. And so again, that's going to vary from individual to individual or community to community, but obviously, like, energy is a big part of that. Land use, all of these things that there are things that can be done to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to reduce emissions from transportation, you name it. So it's kind of a vague answer, obviously, but this is we could spend weeks and months on sorting through that, probably.
Yeah, that's your whole career.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Taisha?
I just had a quick one, Russ, and it's always a pleasure to see you.
Hey, good to see you. Yeah.
This is my third time with this presentation, and each time it just, becomes a deeper issue. But one thing I wanted to just lift up for this group in particular, because it blew my mind away, when you showed the precipitation and temperature, I was reminded of the 1922 Colorado Compact and the fact that those numbers were taken during a wet year. And so oftentimes I like to remind people, although the city of Boulder has a robust water portfolio, we have a lot of paper water, not necessarily wet water. And so again, just more of a comment. I thank you for this presentation, always so brave around that. And you mentioned energy as in response, and again, I know Excel Energy has been trying to pivot to more renewables, but it's still heavily using natural gas. And was just curious if you could just kind of speak to briefly just some of the different energy demands between natural gas and renewables.
Yeah, I mean, from the perspective of greenhouse gas emissions, generally coal is the worst. That is the most emissions per unit of energy. So natural gas is better than coal, but generally renewables will be better than that. And so that is, but that's the challenge that all the communities are facing, right? Is making that transition to electrification. And then there's also the transportation piece, right? Like that's the other. So there's how do we heat and cool our homes and our buildings, and so that is a large part of that mix. Most of Colorado is a lot of natural gas still, and so things are moving towards more renewables, but maybe not as fast as everyone would like. And then the other piece of it is the transportation, where burning gasoline for getting ourselves around, and diesel is more intensive in terms of greenhouse gas emissions than EVs and other modes of transportation, bicycling, whatever. So those are definitely a couple big pieces of the puzzle.
How is the food miles captured in that? There's a lot of emphasis on the vehicle miles traveled, but I haven't seen any data around the food mile.
That's a good question. I mean, it is definitely accounted for in the folks who do these calculations, but I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. So
I've never seen a breakdown. So.
Yeah, I'll look for that, because I know that sort of analysis exists, but I don't recall the numbers off the top of my head.
Awesome. Thank you, Russ.
I had two questions sticking to the topic of, drought and water supply. One is the El Nino that we're expecting, is that expected just to be a 12-month cycle, or is it possible that might be multi-year?
Usually they don't last more than a year, but this one has the chance of being the strongest one that there's ever been, and so I think to some extent all bets are off, because we don't know for sure. But yeah, usually they don't last much more than 12 to 18 months, and then and then it goes back to neutral or back into La Nina conditions.
Well, that may answer the second question I had, which is I know when they started forecasting the super El Nino, along with that, was the, the proviso that it's probably not going to get us out of drought. And is that because it is just going to be a limited period of time, or is it because it's not going to be enough moisture? Or could you just explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think it may be those things, but it also is just that it's uncertain. So like in Colorado, well, part of the frustration here is that El Nino has pretty strong signals to our south and to our north, and we sit kind of right in the middle. And so, if you're in South Texas or Florida, like the chances that you're going to have a wet year this year are really high. Similarly, if you're in like the northern tier of states, it's probably going to be drier than average. And then we sit in the middle. Most of the time, when it's El Nino in the fall and the spring, we tend to be wet. But the winter, the signal is muddier. And of course, that's when our water comes, is in the winter. So we have pretty good correlations between El Nino and more precipitation in the fall and the spring, but the correlation between El Nino and mountain snowpack is basically zero, because the core winter is not when it seems to go our way. So it could be that we have, some of our biggest snow years have been El Nino years. So that's certainly a possibility that we get a huge snow year and it at least fixes a lot of the problems. But it's also possible that we get a bunch of rain in the fall, but then the mountains just do okay rather than great next winter.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks for joining us tonight. That was really interesting, kind of table setter for the rest of our conversation. We're a collection of municipalities in Boulder County. And Boulder County is not a water utility. Everybody else at the table has a water utility. We have a lot of agricultural land and own a lot of water rights that are agricultural water rights. So thank you very much for joining us. And I think we'll go ahead and move directly into Adam Quicklin from Grand County, who's going to tell us about their drought preparedness plan.
Thanks, Russ.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Russ.
I'll be in touch. He's coming up. Maybe I'm not.
Yeah.
Right, Mom.
Yeah, how you doing? Thanks for having me. And Russ was a speaker and an advisor in creation of our, I'm sorry?
Okay.
No, you're
Okay.
fine. Yeah.
I was just saying that Russ was instrumental in creation of our drought management plan as well. I know he was an advisor and they reached out to him quite a bit and he was a guest speaker as well. With that, I do start every one of my drought meetings with the graph that he shared at the beginning, the 2026 water year at a glance. I think it encompasses everything and is a great start to that conversation. So I echo what Russ said.
Adam,
So let me share my
excuse me, let me interrupt you. You're coming in and out a little bit, and we're getting a signal that your network bandwidth is low. I wonder if you might want to turn your camera off, although, yeah, maybe that would help. And you're frozen.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, we can hear you now. And
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Let me share my screen. All right. Can you guys see that?
Yeah.
Okay. So basically, Grand County's drought preparedness program and Appendix A, which is our communication strategy. We're basically the megaphone for the drought conditions and consistent messaging in Grand County. And I believe that this presentation is actually part of our communication strategy, getting out to other groups and sharing what we've done and what we know. So I think this is in line with what we do. So on our next slide, the context of purpose of creating our drought preparedness plan is it's a headwater responsibility. The headwaters of the Colorado are here in Grand County, and what we have is pretty well defined. It's a fairly heavily managed system, and so we need to take responsibility for our own actions. And I think secondarily, this was actually done as a response to some of the farming projects and drought in concert. So I do think part of this was a posture in negotiations for or with the Front Range entities. Secondarily, it's a foundation for compliance. You know, if you have consistent messaging and you're building public trust through that allows people easily to fold in and participate. I think peer pressure is our biggest tool, and I think that's the foundation of which we get people to voluntarily participate in our drought program. I think third, we address, or we try to update our plan and our communication strategy annually. So next would be our program timelines and history. So this effort really began in April of 2029. We went to a Growing Water Smarts Sonoran Institute workshop and came out with a draft outline of a drought program. In July of 2020, we received a technical assistance grant from Growing Water Smart, and we proceeded to gather the stakeholders and develop the drought plan itself. In the fall of July 2020, we completed the plan, and we got MOU signatures from the participating partners. Soon after, we realized that we need a communication strategy, and then we got another technical assistance grant from Growing Water Smart to build Appendix A. And I think that's the further we go into this plan, we're really becoming more of an education and communication entity than determining what the drought elements are or what degree of drought. We're starting to rely much more heavily on the U.S. Drought Monitor Index and concentrate a lot more on the outreach activities. So the first effort was developing the drought management plan, and this is kind of the contract deliverables. From the first technical assistance grant, we created 8 meetings, different subject matters. Each one is weighted a little bit differently. We discussed water rights in great detail, and in the end, we are kind of relying on the DWR to administer the water rights in Division 5. That is their job, and everything we do is a voluntary recommendation. So once you get to water rights administration, it's beyond our scope. The third meeting, smart irrigation, I think this is a fundamental piece to any drought plan. This says smart irrigation, but I'd like to change it more to smart metering. With smart metering, you're looking at irrigation as well as domestic use. And you're looking at the treatment and distribution processes with meters as well. I think water education is the basic or the basis to changing any behavior. And that's really what we're getting at, is we're trying to change people's behavior and make them conserve, or get them to conserve water more, not make them. We want them to do it naturally, organically, because it's the right thing to do. I think our fifth meeting, the drought triggers, I think we put a lot of emphasis on that. And originally we discussed 5 different drought indexes at each and every meeting, and it seems that that was overkill. Right now, we're starting to rely much more heavily, and this was actually the last round of updates to our drought plan that we decided that we would use the U.S. Drought Monitor Index as our primary indicator, and we would use the other 4 to help determine if we needed to go up or down, if there's a 50-50 split between severe drought and exceptional drought kind of thing, then we can look at the other indicators and see for a trend and see if we're going up or down, or if they substantiate going one direction over the other. We can talk about that more a little bit later. And I think the last 3 meetings were really just bringing it together and finalizing the plan. Out of that process, we did come out with 15 different MOU stakeholders. They basically fit into 3 different categories: government, municipalities in the county, and we have water and sand districts, and we have special districts and community organizations that are involved as well. Trout Unlimited, the Headwaters Center. We have an HOA, which is the Fairways at Pole Creek. They have a golf course, so they have augmentation, a little bit more complicated than just a normal subdivision. And then we have a rec district as well as a fire protected district that participate. The contract deliverables on the communication strategy were really the marketing plan and messaging strategy, as well as the design elements. They produced social media ads and print ads and templates for us to use, as well as design elements, colors, logos, fonts, those kind of things as well. Quite integral to what we're doing here. I think or the program governance structure for the plan in general. So out of the general stakeholders, we have the MOU signatories. From that body of signatories, we have a drought preparedness committee, which is 5+ day-to-day members. And then we also have an education and outreach subcommittee. The drought committee members must be signatories. The education outreach committee members do not have to be. And we do have a collaboration policy with outside entities as well when they're supporting the mission of the drought plan. So some core communication objectives. We're really looking for persistent drought literacy. We're putting the message out regularly. In our ads, we're usually trying to hit a different perspective on drought. We've looked at aridification, the longevity of drought from really 1999 on. We've looked at wildfire and drought, and we've looked at more recently, we've advertised some of the relationship of flash floods and drought, trying to, and I think our next subject will be moving out of drought. It's a slower process than most people think. We're lucky it rained this evening, and for a lot of people, they don't understand that the drought still exists tomorrow. So persistent drought education and literacy is quite important to this activity. We do like to make people aware of supply and demand, and not all these efforts are actually done under the Grand County Drought Preparedness Program. On the supply and demand, we participate in a daily water report that's on our radio station, stuff like that, where they give stream flows, they give reservoir levels, they give temperatures, and they mention boat closures and fishing closures and those kind of things as well. We do meet at least monthly, so timely status notification. Things haven't been changing. It's been holding steady in a severe and exceptional situation. So we've been able to just maintain a monthly schedule currently, but there are times where we've had to call impromptu meetings and push out articles. Empowered action, this is a voluntary effort. We really do stress that the residents of our county and each of our water providers, it's voluntary to them, it's voluntary to the water providers, it's voluntary to irrigators and anybody else that wants to participate. We're happy to have them. We're happy to support them in any way that they need. And really a unified county message is the end all be all of it. You know, if there's contradictions all over the place, and inconsistency in messaging, then your residents will be confused as well. So really what we're trying to do is a behavioral change. And so we're looking at a behavioral change framework. And that takes information. That's the education. It takes motivation. You know, we're hoping that stewardship is that motivation. And then, you know, behavioral skills, practical knowledge of how to fix leaks and adjust things, and how, yeah, the daily activities that we can do better to conserve the water, basically, is what we're after. So, key messaging and mapping matrix. I think you'll start to hear me repeat a little bit here, actually, and I think that's the point of this, is to have that message coming in a few different directions where people don't even know that you're like kind of lecturing them, telling, you know, it's coming in from different sources, it's coming in from different perspectives. And so that matrix, I think it's a softer approach, but it's a constant approach. You know, we really concentrate on monitoring local conditions, and conserving the water supply and the headwater stewardship. Again, that's our motivation for that behavioral change. And the first two are really the information behind that, asking for that behavioral change. So we do tailor our message by the drought stage. As I mentioned earlier, in our 5th meeting, which was our drought triggers, we did something that I would advise against, and we created our own drought stage scale that was different from the U.S. Drought Monitor Index. And that's kind of where you see in our drought stage scale, you'll see the corresponding DO, D1, D3, and D4 from the U.S. Drought Monitor Index. This year, the major change we made to our plan was moving to the U.S. Drought Monitor as our primary index. Next year, we will be changing our drought stage scale to match the U.S. Drought Monitor Index. You know, we look at it as we've created confusion, because people are becoming familiar with the U.S. Drought Monitor Index, and then they see ours, and there's different words, and there's different categories and stuff like that. So it is confusion that we are experiencing right now. It is, unfortunately, it's a necessary hardship, because we did not have the money to redo all of our marketing materials to match the U.S. Drought Monitor drought scale. So that is something that we will overtake this winter. So when our drought committee meets, we have a 6-step notification protocol. The first step is really the drought committee certifies the drought stage based on the U.S. Drought Monitor Index indicators. The second step is to notify our education outreach committee. Then we notify stakeholders through direct mail or email, I'm sorry. And with that, we send out our press release. We send our drought stage recommendations, as well as some advertising materials. Then we send alerts to HOAs and chambers and managers. And we have a social media campaign that corresponds with all of the other messages. And then we do a formal press release, usually on the first Friday of each month. So we have a multi-channel delivery network. We use print collateral, we use digital and web media, local media, and outdoor ads. Right now, we are concentrating on the local media and the print collateral. This is my first year in this position. I started last December 1st, and so we are ramping up on a few of these still. And this is where I think we are a little bit different situation than Boulder County, where we have a dedicated radio station and a dedicated newspaper to our county. So with that, they have dedicated followers, and we have kind of a contained audience. But on the print collateral, I mean, we do drought factoids and water conservation tips. Every Friday, we put out a 12-page ad with a factoid or a water conservation tip. Once a month, we put out an advertisement with the drought stage scale, where we sit, is it exceptional drought, severe drought, that kind of thing. And usually there's an educational component attached to it that I described earlier. And then we also try to schedule drought testimonials. And this reaches back to what Russ said about each person having their own drought. We reach out to agriculturalists, we reach out to the HOAs, we reach out to water providers, and we try to get individual perspective articles placed throughout the summer so that we can connect with the different parts of our audience. In addition to that, on the digital and social media, we try to twice a week, we have automated conservation tips and factoids going out. We also place our the same ad that we put out in the newspaper in social media, and we have a web page that's hosted by the Grand County itself. Then we have a radio station that is really partial to water issues. They're named KFFR, but they have a second station as well where they're K-Water, KWTR. We are very fortunate with them. So here we pay for drought ads. We are in the paid ads, we're doing the conservation tips, basically. We get free public service announcements where we declare the drought stage and direct them to resources. Then we have a daily water report where somebody, I think I mentioned this earlier, where every day somebody does like a 1.5-minute report. There's a daily fishing report as well, and these things go hand in hand. And these are not underneath the moniker of our drought plan, but they definitely enhance and reinforce what we're doing. And probably 4 days out of the week are done by our drought committee members. Where they give stream temperatures, they give stream flows, they give reservoir levels, they give closure information, that kind of stuff. And so really all those three things in concert, and with the 3 or 4 things that we do under each of these channel delivery networks, we feel that we have a pretty good weave that gets to most people in our community in one fashion or another. And it's amazing. I've even had friends from Fort Collins say that they've been streaming KFFR and heard our ads. And, these are people that want to come up here and go fishing and stuff. So I believe it's working. I believe we have a long way to go. But this is what the plan is for. And really, we are targeting different sectors. We have a community and civic education, and that's where our emphasis is. And I think that's more because this is my first year in this position. But I think next year we'll have a bigger focus on the business and commercial sector. We will reach out to the chambers and see how we can develop that side of things a little bit greater. With that, I'd like to open it for questions and discussion. I think you guys, to be honest, I think you guys, with this consortium of cities, you have a leg up. You already have an organization. I don't. This seems like it's really just the municipalities and the county. It may not include the water providers yet. I assume half of you have your own systems, and other ones probably have special districts as well. It's important to get the special districts on board, but I think you guys have a leg up there. I think we have a leg up on the communication avenues. So, yeah, let's discuss.
Great, thank you very much. Adam, if you want to try turning your camera back on, it's kind of hard to discuss with a
Yeah, I'd love to.
screen. We'll see how it goes. A lot of that's something, a lot of really great work. So I'll open the floor up to questions or discussion. And, and then I think we do want to just talk about what all of our communities are doing and how we can work together, kind of maybe in the way that Grand all came together.
Maybe I can further this a little bit. The committee always wants to do a little bit more. And what I found is we have nonprofits, we have HOAs, we have some other entities in there as well. And it's interesting because they're kind of segregating out to where our municipalities and our water providers are the drought committee. And our nonprofits and such really have the energy and are doing the education and outreach side of things. And so where you guys may not have that nonprofit component, I think there is opportunity for you guys to engage them to do some of the dirty work as well. I think we are pushing forward with Water Now Alliance. We actually have a 250-hour in-kind grant. It's not money, so it's not considered a grant, but it's Project Accelerator. And I think that would be an incredible opportunity for you guys to organize and put something together. I would suggest probably it's an opportunity to look into it. This is what they do, is they like to help get you organized and get a process off the ground. I do want to share that I understand a lot of your perspectives. I am a trustee of my town as well. I'm in my 4th term. I serve on the Colorado Basin Roundtable as a municipal representative. I work for the county as a water resource specialist. So I do live in this world and understand multiple perspectives and try to employ those as well. So.
Very interesting. Yeah.
I missed what organization you said to partner with?
Water Now, okay.
Yeah, we're working with them. We have a Project Accelerator grant right now. And it's how do we, the water providers are all on board, but how do we engage them a little bit more? We are finding that the life of the organization and the energy is really coming from the nonprofits. I think like I said, you guys have a leg up starting with this consortium of cities, and if you guys have buy-in, then your entity has a buy-in and such. We do have our MOUs do expire after 5 years, and so we're going to be going through a process of going through all of our entities and trying to expand MOU membership stakeholder group. So.
Adam, you're starting to break up and freeze a little bit again. So
no.
Yeah, you might want to turn that camera off again.
I'm gonna move closer to my. Let's see if that works.
Closer to your router. Okay, so questions for Adam? Folks? Yeah,
well, okay. I'm wondering if you have noticed any reduction in the water usage by people in Grant County since you've begun this educational program.
So we are not a water provider. And I think those are actually some of the things we're going to try to achieve in our project accelerator. What we're hearing from our water providers is they'd like a clearinghouse and for information and trading out what they're doing and exactly that kind of information. I think that is a place that we can develop a little bit more. I do think some of our jurisdictions have smart meters, and so they're more prepared to be able to give that kind of feedback than others. I do know Fraser, we instituted water restrictions the beginning of July, and we had a 30% reduction in irrigation, which in that first 2 weeks before our so the messaging is working. And it really takes that cooperation and that collaborative effort, and for the follow up with the jurisdictions, because those are authorities. They have, as a water provider, they can make code, they can charge rates. They're where we are just a bullhorn, basically saying, hey, these are the conditions, these are the things you can do. But we are working on, I think that feedback loop is incredibly important to be able to, and with our tool being peer pressure, I think once we start getting that feedback in, then we can start using peer pressure from neighbors. We can start using peer pressure between water providers, and so on and so on. So I think that is definitely a direction we're pushing.
I have two questions for you. One is about your engagement campaign. You all have a pretty big tourism base there in certain parts of your county, which we do as well. And I think that that's our biggest struggle, is not reaching people who live there and care. It's reaching people who are there for like a very short period of time. And I'm curious about your outreach to them and how that's worked for you, especially, you talks about the hotel messaging and the restaurant messaging, but we're just wondering if that's been effective. And then my second question is, have you all done any policy work with the municipalities or other water providers thinking about dead water in systems and how pipe infrastructure in particular could be improved so that you have less need to bleed off dead water from those systems and conserve that way?
Okay, so the first one, with our outreach to the business community, I do know that we do have some restaurants that are putting out like you need to ask for water and such. I have been reached out to by a couple hot tub companies as well, asking if there are particular mandates here or there. And I think this is where the clearinghouse information would be great. A lot of people don't even know what jurisdiction they're in. So I think that's a start. And then, but I do see greater efforts in the business community and utilizing the chambers of commerce and such in the future. Thus far this year, the majority of our efforts have been direct to customer and direct to the water provider. We do include the chambers in our emails, but we could scale up our efforts a little bit further. And then I'm sorry, the second question, I'm sorry.
Just curious about every water system has places where dead water happens, where it's no longer drinkable because the water's aged too much.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that we work on pretty frequently in our capital planning. And I'm just wondering if you all have collectively kind of built or enacted any policy looking at that dead water, because it can be easily 1 million gallons in a very short period of time. And I think that's one of the bigger kind of less resilient areas of water infrastructure that we have, is just thinking about how we handle dead water and how we might be able to improve our piping so that it doesn't happen so frequently.
So I would say that is probably outside the scope of our drought plan. I do know in Fraser we have enacted ordinances saying that a dead end line can be no longer than 500 linear feet to minimize that dead water, and the waste of the flushing water. I do know that we do make exceptions to that if there's a cluster on the end, and they can calculate that the resident population flushes that water sufficiently. Once I think that is where we would like to develop the clearinghouse for all of our municipalities and water providers to be able to share that kind of information, because we are not a water provider, we are not an authority, we're just a drought committee. Really, we're a spinoff from the county. This was a county effort, and I think I think those are important things to be able to share, and a clearinghouse would help us spur those kind of conversations and share those ideas. So I think again, those are kind of our next steps is with a project accelerator is how do we bring in that information, and then how do we disseminate it again. So
Adam, thank you very much for giving us that perspective. I totally lost track of time. I'm a very bad facilitator here. No, that was really important for us to just see what one community has done, and please join us for our discussion here. I have a couple of discussion prompts that you have your agenda, you have as well, but given that we are a consortium of cities, and you're in left-hand water.
Well, yeah, left-hand water.
Yeah. I think what we wanted to talk about, and this is really pulling off of previous conversations that we had about, really wanting to look at drought conditions and what we as a consortium could do is, how do your organizations define the issue of drought preparedness? We may not want to spend too much time on that one, but what are each of us doing to address that preparedness and water conservation? And then maybe even most importantly, is there a role there? Thank you, Nick. Is there a role for this organization, regionally to do this? And, this is mid-August, we're dead in the middle of this drought. It'll go on, so it's not like the opportunity has come and gone. It will go on here. It's been multi-year, so just invite some free-form discussion on these prompts.
Well, I'm especially thank you,
Yeah.
and thank you everyone for the presentation. I'm especially compelled around that last question of the regional approach. And I know that the city of Boulder, we're going to be creating an integrated water plan in 2027, and they've started to pull information around that. I think it would be helpful. I mean, my goal, or the gold standard, if you will, is the ways that our respective staff and organizations work around the wildfire and emergency response. I mean, that's just an area where it is so streamlined. It is so, relationally tight, policy tight. And I would love to see similar efforts around crosswalking our respective water plans and drought plans, especially as it relates to messaging and coordination, the funding components and technical support, where I feel like, it doesn't make, we have a consultant, you have a consultant, and you have a consultant, and we're all basically doing similar scopes of work. So those are a couple of areas that, when you ask this question, our policy team and water team and myself took a look at and wanted to lift up, but I'm very, very interested. I think it will be absolutely critical, currently and in the years to come.
Mm-hmm.
I could speak to it, and it already is somewhat. This year we had that. I was on 2 meetings with most of the other water providers in the county. I think it was started by Boulder County, their water, before doing messaging on the drought after the first stage was declared by the governor. And, most of the community, I think everyone here and Lafayette, some others, we were all on a couple of calls, how we were gonna message out the drought concerns.
That was at
And-
the staff level, right?
Yeah,
Okay, so
yeah.
not the councils or.
right.
Okay, I just wanna, good to know.
So, yeah, so there was some there
We got some.
on that, right?
I think back to the drought, the 2002-3 drought, which, was so severe and trees were dying, all kinds of really, valuable, incredible trees were dying and there was a lot of legislative activity in the ensuing years around allowing people to not lose their water rights if they let them sit and not use them so they could fallow their fields and the issue of being able to lease water or Boulder lend some water to Boulder County for agricultural purposes or vice versa. And there might be some opportunities for, maybe this is happening at the staff level for all the water providers that sit around this table and on the screen to look at, how can we do that? Like just be better prepared to share the resources, the water resources that we have. And I actually don't know, since Boulder County's resources are ag water rights. I think we have the ability to do that too, but I'm not even sure.
In light of time, I shared some stuff with Nick, and I don't have to go over that, but just some brief points. Longmont has prepared itself for a 7-year drought, where sort of level that it would that we would start at. Before that, we would start at forcing all city residential houses as well as city and industrial as well as city facilities to reduce to 20%. Right now, the city itself is at 10%. It's reduction of that. And some people are like asking us, why are you watering during sometimes parts of the day? And our answer is that we're watering when we have our water. You have to draw your water when it's available. So that's the only reason. So when we hear people on a lot of our facilities, I mean, we've got the investment of our golf courses and our parks and that sort of thing, but we have reduced quite a bit. And so across the board, we have reduced all of our water. We've actually had that conversation at Parks and Recreation Board on Monday night, and Tuesday we had this conversation with a pre-session with council to talk about that. And so, but I don't want to go over that full presentation. I think if we can just share it with others, because to your point, we all have these consultants, and one consultant and staff, to your point, are coming from this point. So you can see from that, is Longmont doing something that you hadn't thought of? And so just take a look at that.
And Louisville is using non-potable water for watering all the golf courses and parks and things.
That's us.
Yeah.
I wonder, so each of the municipal systems that are represented by this group draw from different water systems. They don't all come from the same. So there's Northern Colorado, there's water, or is watershed plus Big Thompson, I think. I don't.
A third.
Yeah, and and so there's sort of different availability of water and different water systems that feed these, and some may be actually healthier than others as well. And I mean, nobody wants to share their water, especially, but that might be something to look at also is whether.
I love that idea there. Is that something the staff has been doing, looking at the different sources and which ones are more vulnerable across the municipalities and county?
Well, for me, and Justin Lyons,
Sorry.
and so not seeing all of the other, but I do work now a bit more with the Watershed Center, but also Left Hand St. Vrain Conservancy District, and they're working on in-stream, not specifically in-stream flows, but what are now titled environmental flows, but that is working with people from the county, different staff to try to say, at that time it was, what can we do with our various water rights to help keep water where we need to at the creek? But it could, I think, be transposed to an idea of, for drought, what can you do to share water rights? How could it interact? That's something I've been interested in and trying to do more of as I got more involved, from just being, hey, here's water to the houses. I needed to understand water rights a little bit more, and feeling somewhat confident, exactly as you said, what if we're really pushing on the drought and conserve all your water. I think there's a concern of scaring people, say, okay, now we're not going to let any water go, and we really want to be out there trying to talk, well, if we do have water rights, like we have some water rights sitting up in Button Rock Reservoir, is there a way to use them and not have the concern of just giving them away? So how could you work together to do that? I think that's a big question, and it gets pretty legal pretty quickly. One of my other quick concerns would be also on the messaging aspect. I was going to ask Adam, but to me, I think we also want to be careful, because I quickly come to the fact of, yeah, everyone in Colorado was talking about conserving and using less and less water for what? So that the other states below can say, yes, you don't need water. See, you guys are doing great. We need the water.
That was our conversation this afternoon.
Oh, I missed it.
That was the earlier drought conversation is, oh, great. So it can all go down the Platte River to Nebraska.
Yeah.
And that's not a very generous attitude, but I understand the attitude.
Well, we have to be really careful. I was talking to my brother-in-law, who has worked for Coors and consulted with this UN on this as a consultant for water engineering. And literally just the other day about this. And, you know, what we don't want is folks who have abundant water in the east to start dabbling in our compact here. If they get in and start stirring their fingers in it from the congressional point of view, we're screwed. It will never get fixed.
I mean, we're screwed anyway.
We're screwed, but that's like piling on.
Yeah, so Bill, I just had two things. So we're very fortunate to have headquartered Western Resource Advocates here in Boulder. And they work in 7 states. And so that if there was a regional push to have conversations and represent, definitely I would engage them. And then the second thing is, what was really interesting to me is how the climate change is exacerbating our droughts. And so what can the individual do? So there's been, we did the switch together, which Boulder County promoted, and went to solar Tesla batteries with Excel rebates, the state rebates. We got an electric car. I got an electric bike. Like, there are these little lifestyle changes, and it would be interested to know, how much of a difference that can make, because if enough people make those changes, I know we're small and compared to globally, but just having that mindset of just how you're living, I think is helpful. And
if you're not a Platte River Power Authority customer, you might not know this, but we just had a groundbreaking in Weld County, just to the east of the Budweiser brewing plant, Fort Collins, where they're developing a full battery powered system that will allow at least 4 hours for the cities of Longmont, Fort Collins, Loveland, and Estes Park to maintain, to get, on this. So, I mean, we're moving in that direction. And I think Boulder could do a smaller version, because Boulder County could do that. They're looking for space. And I think, I'm not going to put this bug in your ear there, Claire. I think when that plant in Lyons area, that cement plant goes, that would be an opportunity to put something like that in, because I mean, it's already.
Yeah.
I have that
It won't happen.
sort of not planned out, but that is the high level plan, yes.
Yeah,
That's
that's
what
what I'm
we didn't do our water.
I need to, so I have to
Yeah.
take responsibility for very sure I'm gonna be here because it's 7:30 and I really feel like I need to let my staff go. I need to let the security staff go. And I'm really sorry because we're just really getting warmed up in this.
Well, can I just add quickly to the list, and then I would love to have a more conversation at our next meeting, but you, in the notes. Things we haven't talked about, cybersecurity attacks, which are on the rise for municipalities and other water sources. The state coordinated state advocacy effort. Because again, the state plays a role, and I think that's something that we can do is do stronger advocacy around things that we know to help us. And then scenario planning, like we did for the emergency response. I just would love to do some scenario planning across for wildfires, cybersecurity. The majority of the city of Boulder staff comes from all of their areas. And so we are, I mean, even though we have different rights and everything, it's still in our best interest to make sure our teachers are going to have water. So anyway, just wanted to add.
And there's the intersection of wildfire preparedness and water is, all the work that the Watershed Collaborative does on, after a wildfire, that's when our water supply is at risk from mudslide, debris flows, and it's another scenario plan of, say, Longmont and the St. Vrain.
Well, this is an FAA situation. I had a problem with FAA saying that they could send drones over our water supplies. And one of those drones would fall burn it down, then it would contaminate our water supply. And they said, well, we can always action afterwards. That was so comforting, I couldn't believe it.
Also FEMA.
Yeah. Well, folks, as we wrap up, we could continue this conversation at our next meeting. And we can also, say, why don't we send out the other topics? We've got 2 more meetings this year, I think. The other topics, the year flew. The other topics that we had brainstormed and talked about maybe wanting to look at, let's send all those out and everybody maybe do a doodle poll on what are your top 2, 3 priorities for our next 2 meetings. And I will watch the clock better.
All of our drought plans somewhere that, I'm happy to share ours and the presentation that you had for Longmont. It just would be really wonderful.
And do we have the slide presentations for tonight?
We won't get them if we don't have them already. Yeah, thank you. Adam, thank you so much.
Oh, no problem.
To hear your work.
All right.
And I think we can go ahead and
Radio station. A radio station there?
end the meeting.
Perfect. It could be a radio station.
Well, I mean, we have KGNU. Yeah.
I'm really impressed by just the frequency that they're doing their water.
Yeah.
Very good.
Somebody's still there. You know,
Yeah.
Bye, Heather.